Hello, my name is Jared Ludlow, Publications Director at the BYU Religious Studies Center, your weekly resource for gospel scholarship. And today we'll be talking about some possible resources to accompany your Come Follow Me readings for October 10th through 16th, the first part of Jeremiah. The first one is called Before Abraham Was, Divine Election in the Ancient Near East. It was written by Dana Pike, a former religion professor here at BYU, and is found in a volume honoring Robert J. Matthews. And in this article, he particularly focuses on a passage that talks about how God knew Jeremiah before he was even born. And so he talked about this concept of divine election in the ancient Near East and how that might relate to the Latter-day Saint doctrine of foreordination. And he points out that there's some concerns that people often have with the concept of election, feeling like it's not fair or just to have elect people. And so he deals with some of those concerns because throughout the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible, there are a lot of notions of divine election. He talks about those passages of Scripture that denote that either people, or particularly the people of Israel, were elected by God to serve and do certain things. He then compares that with some divine election passages in non-biblical ancient Near East texts. Particularly, he notes that a lot of Mesopotamian texts talk about this concept, and not surprisingly, among particularly the royalty. And so, for example, Mesopotamian kings are often described as named, called by the gods, as servant of the gods, as shepherd of the people on behalf of the gods, and as favorite and beloved of the gods. And then Dana Pike transitions to the restoration view of these ancient election claims. And he makes an important point that Latter-day Saints believe that covenant opportunity in this life is related to premortal divine election, both individual and collective, and that election is the result of God's foreknowledge and purposes, and is based on his children's obedience to him. And so he concludes his article with this statement: for those who accept the restored gospel of Jesus Christ, election, when correctly understood, is not a human invention, nor is it just the inexplicable miracle of divine grace. It is one of the major means by which God brings his saving power and purposes to his children in this fallen, mortal world while still honoring their agency. The second article is called Jeremiah and the New Paradigms of the Gathering, and it's by Ray Huntington, a former religion professor here at BYU, and comes from a Religious Educator article. He opens his article by talking about the Exodus and its importance throughout Scripture, both in later passages of the Old Testament, as well as the Book of Mormon and so forth. But then he points out that how the Exodus used to be the way to illustrate God's power. According to Jeremiah, that motif would eventually be replaced by another paradigm. And for this, he quotes from the passage of Jeremiah 16:14 through 15. Therefore, behold, the days come, saith the Lord, that it shall no more be said, the Lord liveth that brought up the children of Israel out of the land of Egypt. But rather, the Lord liveth that brought up the children of Israel from the land of the north, and from all the lands whither he had driven them. And I will bring them again into their land that I gave unto their fathers. So here Jeremiah is talking about, of course, the doctrine of gathering and bringing the scattered Israel from all these different locations. And this is the new paradigm that Jeremiah is introducing. And part of this new paradigm, as we fast forward to the latter days, this latter-day gathering will surpass the events of the Exodus in terms of its sheer magnitude, the outpouring of spiritual and temporal blessings, and the use of the Book of Mormon as the instrument of gathering. And so he then will talk about these different aspects in different sections to point out the great blessings that God has promised in these latter days. And he concludes with a statement from Joseph Smith that the subject of the gathering is a principle I esteem to be of the greatest importance to those who are looking for salvation in this generation, or in these that may be called the latter times. All that the prophets that have written, from the days of righteous Abel down to the last man that has left any testimony on record for our consideration, in speaking of the salvation of Israel in the last days, goes directly to show that it consists in the work of the gathering. And so this certainly goes along with our current prophet, President Nelson's emphasis on the gathering of the house of Israel and how important that is, and the many blessings that will come and God's powerful manifestations as a result of these promises. The third article is called History and Jeremiah's Crisis of Faith by Kent Brown, a former religion professor here at BYU, and it comes from a volume called Isaiah and the Prophets. And this is quite a deep historical context piece where he looks at the situation of Jeremiah's early prophecies. Because in his early prophecies, Jeremiah prophesied about an unidentified peril or danger which was to come upon Jerusalem and Judah from the north. And many scholars initially thought this was an attack by the Scythians that came into the land, but Kent Brown and others later on challenge this and point out that it's the later Babylonian invasion that will fulfill this prophecy. But because that Babylonian invasion didn't happen for several decades, Jeremiah started complaining about unfulfilled prophecies. Here he had given this prophecy of this threat from the north, and then nothing really happened. And so, among other things, the situation had resulted in Jeremiah's being totally and publicly discredited. In fact, even his family had joined in a plot to take his life, apparently because whatever had happened had created an enormous public outcry against him. And so Jeremiah lapsed into a period of silence. The prophet was deeply troubled by the apparent non-fulfillment of his prophecies. And we learn this from what are the so-called Confessions of Jeremiah. And they're usually numbered 6, and they come from various chapters in Jeremiah. And so he kind of confesses and laments to the Lord for these unfulfilled prophecies. And Kent Brown goes through and talks about these different confessions. But Kent Brown concludes with the important point that it is to Jeremiah's everlasting credit that he remained faithful as he passed through an extraordinarily severe test of his trust in the Lord. But pass it he did. And so the most tragic of prophets, Jeremiah emerged from this crucible of trial more deeply committed than ever. And in the end, he does witness the onslaught of the Babylonians and the eventual taking of Jerusalem and so forth, and the fulfillment of this earlier prophecy.